Okay. Well, thank you, Colombe Cahen-Salvador, for being with me today. Colombe, you are running to become UN Secretary General, and you are also the co-founder of Atlas, the global movement, the global political movement. And before that, you were also co-founder of Volt Europa, the first pan-European political party. So could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about Atlas?
Yeah, it's so nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Colombe. I'm originally French, and I've been working on mobilizing people across borders for the last 8 years, something like this, with the idea basically that regardless of where we come from, regardless of our differences, whether they be linguistic, cultural, national, or other, we share, at the end of the day, most of the same hopes and dreams and the same fears. And it sounds a bit idealistic, but it's actually true. Having worked with people in over 134 countries on a daily basis, I can tell you that we all face the same issues. The level to which those issues impact us are very different. The impact that they have on our daily lives are very different, but the issues remain the same, right? We all want to live in a safe environment. We want to be able to be ourselves, have access to basic services like healthcare, housing, and so on. And ideally, we'd like not to live a world even more fucked up than the one we live in today. The order of things and how it impacts people every day changes, but regardless of where we live, we kind of want the same thing. And so first with Volt and now with Atlas, I realized that there was a huge strength in actually uniting them if we had the same hopes and dreams, and if a lot of those threats or potential opportunities and dreams impact us the same way, why can't we work together to solve them? Especially when we're talking about global threats. So at Atlas, and I'll tell you about Atlas in just a second, but we consider that there are more or less 6 survival threats. So threats that impact all of humanity and are moral or physical survival. They're pretty straightforward. One of them is climate change. Unless we take radical climate action, we're all gonna die, to put it bluntly. It doesn't look that good. Second one is poverty. 1 in 10 human beings on Earth live in extreme poverty. That's less than $1.90 a day. It's insane when we have enough money to be able to not have anyone live in poverty. And the third one is pandemics, so global health. I don't really need to spell it out. We've just been through COVID-19. We're at high risk of other pandemics. We're not preparing for it. It doesn't look that great either. Wars, just look at Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan. I mean, the list goes on, right? It's killing an enormous amount of people, displacing many more, and so on and so forth. Unregulated technology, so AI is the typical example, and it represents great opportunities. Amazing one. This video is being, there's an automatic transcript, right, on our recording right now. It makes our life much easier. It's also going to impact jobs and the way we conduct wars, the way people trust or distrust democracy. It has the potential to uproot a society. And the list goes on, from dictatorships to nuclear weapons and so on. And so basically, we're facing those threats. And we can't deal with them on our own. We can't deal with them only within our own little countries. As you can hear from my accent, I'm French. France is never going to solve any of those threats. And so we have no choice but to unite and work together. And so I co-founded Atlas, a long story short, which has 25,000 people in over 134 countries and is getting ready to run for elections across the world to seize political power and be able to implement coordinated responses to those global challenges. Complicated words, in short, we need political power to solve those threats, so let's get it.
Wow, congratulations. Such a great career so far. I can't wait to see what you're up to next. And one of those things is that you are running for UN Secretary General, like I said. So could you tell us a bit more about this process, what it entails, the selection, and what would be your priorities if you are our next UN Secretary General?
So I still can't get used to that sentence. It's the weirdest thing I've ever said and the weirdest thing anyone has ever said to me. But to make it simple, we don't have a global political system. We live in a global society. We're all connected. We're speaking from different countries. We're facing the same threats. We don't have a global political system that represents us or that is capable of dealing with those threats. The closest thing we have is the United Nations. It was built after the Second World War with the idea of preserving peace and security. I love it. Let's do it. Let's preserve peace and security, right? It's the right thing to do. Not going so well either. The UN is failing at ensuring peace and security. Just open the news and it's pretty clear. It's succeeding at a lot of things, right? The UN managed to eradicate polio, is distributing countless meals a day, is helping refugees. I mean, it's doing a great job, but politically, it's not doing so well. And I think it's because it lacks political leadership. So I'm not pretending I'm the solution to all of the world's problems. I'm definitely not. But I think the system that appoints the chief of the UN, the Secretary General is the chief of the UN, it's so messed up that it means that this person cannot do anything, and that the UN is stalled on most major issues. So to make it simple, because most people, including my friends and family, don't know what the UN is, don't know what the UN chief is, and don't know why it matters. The UN is a membership organization of 193 countries, not all countries are including. Palestine, Taiwan are not member states, don't have a voice. But it's not really what it is. I don't know what's happening behind me. There's a fireworks. Microsoft got very excited when I started speaking about the UN.
Special effects.
I love it. I should have this in real life. But so basically there's 193 countries, but not all countries have a voice. At the end of the day, 5 countries actually have a voice. And those are the so-called winners of the Second World War. France, the UK, the US, China, and Russia have a veto power over anything that matters at the UN. And at the end of the day, they choose who the next UN chief is. And when you consider the geopolitical situation in which we are, when if you put Russia and France or the US or the UK in a room, they won't agree on anything, let alone one person to represent humanity's interests, since their interests are so divergent. It means that we get someone who often is the minimum common denominator, or who's completely unable to speak out about what those powers are doing. And those 5 powers are committing war crimes or crimes against humanity, each one of them, to different scales, to different extents, but all of them. And as a result, systematically block meaningful political action on a lot of topics. So long story short, but basically without explaining what's wrong with the system, it's difficult to understand why, I'm 30, I'm running for UNSG. It's really weird. And there's no such thing. But the system is so messed up that it doesn't enable the UN to do what it wants. And so at Atlas, because we want to create a global political system, we think it's needed. We said, okay, let's run for UNSG. That's the normal thing to do, Obviously, there's no election. It's undemocratic. 5 countries decide behind closed doors, and then they pretend there's a vote in the General Assembly, which is basically the parliament of the UN. But there's only one candidate up for vote, so it's not a real vote. But we said, let's change this. Let's make this a presidential campaign. I'll run, if other people want to run, please go for it. I'll run and try to mobilize as many people as possible on the streets, online, in events, to challenge the system. You never know. Countries might listen and might actually do something different. But to say the system is untenable, we need someone that represents the people, that represents the world, and not just 5 countries' interests, in order to have the legitimacy and credibility to take action, reform the UN, and tackle those challenges. And in the process, because you can't put all of your eggs in one basket, we're doing something else. I'm crowdsourcing political priorities and programs from across the world to bring to the UN. So even if I fail, which is likely, I'll go to the next UN Secretary General, hopefully a woman, it's been 8 years of men, and say, look, you haven't been elected by the people of the world, but this is what they want. At least this gives you the legitimacy to be able to act on those threats and be able to move the UN a bit forward. So long story short, that's what I'm doing. It's a very weird thing because it doesn't exist, trying to invent a global political race, but it's fun.
Yes, love it. Challenging the status quo is always something that I resonate with. So I applaud you for that. I think it demands a lot of courage to do something like that.
Thank you very much.
So you already talked a little bit about Atlas, the global movement that you co-founded, which strives to unite humanity, in your words, beyond the borders that are established on the maps, kind of like ideally a global political party to tackle, like you said, the global problems that require global solutions, like climate change, but also income inequality, for example. So concretely, could you explain us how do you make that happen? Could you give a few examples of the problems that you have had a positive effect on?
Yeah, so we launched Atlas in 2020, 2 weeks before the pandemic, actually. And in our opening paper, we said if there's ever an alien invasion or a pandemic, it will become clear that we need a global political movement. 2 weeks later, there was a pandemic. We launched Atlas as an advocacy movement. So not as a political organization, because I've done politics in Europe before. So I co-founded Volt and understood a bit how to mobilize people across borders in Europe. I had no idea how to do so across the world, know if it was possible, and know if people wanted it, right? I knew very little outside of Europe, and I don't pretend I know much more now, but at least I understand what I don't know. And so we started as an advocacy organization for 3 years. We did a lot of campaigns on democracy, climate, access to vaccines, fiscal justice, and so on, with the idea of mobilizing people on all continents with different methodologies, building a movement, and impacting change, obviously, and understanding what works and what doesn't work, and creating a political philosophy that we built. And over those 3 years, we had way more defeats than successes, way more failures than successes, but we had a couple of things that I think impacted a bit of change. At the beginning of the pandemic, for example, it became very clear that rich countries were going to be hoarding vaccines. And they do that every single time around. And there was a hope that it wouldn't be the case, because after H1N1, which was a previous risk of pandemic, we created something called the influenza preparedness framework, whereas for any influenza, we would have to share vaccines, tech, etc. COVID wasn't one of those. It didn't qualify as an influenza. So it was clear that a few countries were going to hoard vaccines and the rest of the world was going to wait for years. Way more people were going to die. It was going to backfire because strains were going to come back. Exactly what happened. So we said, we know it's too late to be able to change this. It will happen. What we can try to do is we can try to put up a first barrier of defense for different countries. So to ensure that health workers, which is less than 1% of the global population, are protected, because they are first line of defense, because it's the right thing to do, because they need to be able to treat patients, because they need to be able to be safe. And so we did a campaign to have the World Health Assembly, basically the parliament of the World Health Organization, which is basically health ministry at the global level. And we did a campaign for them to accept to distribute vaccines to all health workers, regardless of their nationalities, at the same time across the world. It was successful in the sense that the chief of this organization acknowledged it, said it was good, agreed to it. It didn't happen after. So to some extent, we had a success to pass the message that equity needed to happen. The WHO, I think, tried its best to do it. Member states and a few countries hoarded vaccines too fast with that framework in place to push them not to do it. That's one example. And other examples is we created coalitions of opposition leaders in authoritarian countries, so people that work for democracy in dictatorships, to push democratic countries to act together when dealing with dictatorships. So to make it simple, dictatorships love to stick together. I'm sure people have seen Russia and North Korea becoming best friends suddenly, so that North Korea can provide weapons to Russia and Russia are very advantageous to North Korea. Same with China and Myanmar and so on. They love to work together and they do it really well. Democracies it's the strength of democracy. We love to disagree on every single thing, which is good. But when you're dealing with authoritarian countries, you need to be able to coordinate sanctions, responses, and so on. And so we created coalitions of very influential opposition leaders to call for closer collaborations. And some of the ideas like the D10, the 10 democracy, because democracies actually made wave and were picked up by some global organizations. And one last that I can mention, and then again, please bear in mind that most of the others were failures, some were successes, is we organized a boycott of Russia's presidency of the United Nations Security Council. So the UN Security Council has a rotating presidency, and Russia on April 1st last year, actually, biggest stroke of the year, became the president of the UN Security Council, a country that is invading another one. And so we staged a walkout of 4 countries during the presidency so that it wouldn't be able to pass measures. And we did lots of other weird stuff and campaigns and so on.
Fantastic. The awareness raising is in itself such a huge accomplishment, and it's always the first steps towards action. So I think this is notable, and yeah, congrats on that. I love the idea of practicing democracy at the global level, and as you mentioned already, it's clear that the United Nations is very far from being the perfect site to do that, but it is the most tangible institutions that there is right now for global governance, so the structures and the rules in place for cooperation at the scale of the planet. So how do you find balance between preserving what works and reforming what doesn't work? Could you share a few examples of what you would keep and what you would completely change in the UN system?
So I'm speaking in my name, not in Atlas's name, because my view on this changes every single day based on the news. And
Okay.
and I think so. I would love to have a global democratic governance, one where we vote, where we are represented, and so on. I have a thing that the UN is not always the place for this, and not necessarily should be the place for this every single time. So what I mean is we might need different forums for different purposes. So when you consider that 40% of the world lives in dictatorships, cannot vote, but we need those countries to be able to tackle climate change, right? We need all countries to come together. We need a forum where we accept to some extent to work with dictatorships. And this means that it can't be purely democratic, because we need a way to talk to China, however much I dislike this idea, to be able to solve climate change. It's needed, right? Or to be able to regulate AI. We actually need to work together to do this. There are other challenges where we should work as democracies for democracies. But I think some of the global challenges need to be dealt with together, including countries that we deeply disagree with on basically every single value. And to some extent, this, I think, is the strength of the UN. It's a miracle, in a way, that it still exists at a time where we are so polarized across the world. It's the strength of the UN to be this convening power. So I don't know if I would make everything fully democratic. I personally really want a global democratic system of governance. I think this might be a parallel one. I think we might have a few systems of governance, and one might be made of all democratic countries on earth that want global democracy, that want global representation. You could think of, models like the African Union, the European Union, to give countries advantages to join this, whether it's free movement or whatever. You could think of different elements to incentivize this. And this might be a global democratic model. On the side, we need a platform that represents all countries. It doesn't mean that I would keep the UN as it is, because I think it's unable to do its job. And I think just like before the Second World War, we used to have a previous version of the UN that was the League of Nations that died. It was destroyed. It didn't manage to avoid the Second World War. Right now, the UN is failing to avoid most wars. It has an impossible task. I'm not pretending it's easy, but it's failing to do so. And some of this is due to its structure, to its lack of competences, and so on. So this I would definitely change. First thing, I would abolish the veto power. I find it insane to govern by veto. It's not a thing. And it's you govern by majority, by qualified majority, not by veto. You don't have a few countries, especially when it's only 5 versus the total number of countries, which is 193, that can veto anything. It's completely, it can't happen. So I would abolish this, and we need an executive body. We can elect that one. And also authoritarian countries can elect that one. We can think of different models. But I would have something that actually represents the world and that enables decisions to be made. Doesn't work by veto. That's the first thing I would change. And I would change a lot more things. I would actually enable global taxation. How can a global body like the UN have power if it can't even raise its own funds, if it's dependent on member states agreeing to what it does? It's impossible. We have global companies. Think of Amazon, Meta, blah, blah, blah. But for the fact that they evade taxes and should pay them, they operate across borders. We can actually have a global taxation system with a global redistribution. And this would give the UN enough power to be able to change a lot of things, to be able to finance a climate transition, to be able to do a lot. But we need to give it the proper competences, budgets, and legitimacy through reform to be able to do so.
Absolutely. There is clearly a lot of work out there. But it's true that, what you said, that clearly we have some global problems, and there are different views across the world about the best way of going about this and what is the best solution to resolve a certain problem. So what's the best angle? What's the best approach? So at Atlas, how do you decide on the policy solutions you put forward? How do you ensure that they are inclusive and representative of diverse interests and concerns? And what would be your advice to empower people to be heard in global politics, perhaps in spaces where they feel like they aren't being heard?
So let me start with the last part. I think people are not heard because they can't be heard. So I don't have an advice to be heard because there's no structure. I think there's fake structures to make people feel like they have a voice. If you look at the climate conferences, we always have great speeches by incredible activists that I really respect. This does not mean they are heard. They are given a stage, and then countries go into a closed room and make decisions without involving people that are most impacted, affected, or that work on this. So I don't think right now there's a stage to be heard on the global level. But for NGOs do listen to people, political movements do listen. But I think the structures don't enable this as well. At all, sorry. There's no petition mechanism. That's why we're transitioning from an activism movement to a political one. There's no way to actually be heard by the UN. Sometimes by luck, they pay a bit of attention, but they don't have to. And not if it actually disturbs them. So I don't have advice on how to be heard at the global level because it does not exist. I have advice to get power so that you change the global level so that it's possible. And I don't believe right now that any of the initiatives to hear different groups are valid from the United Nations. You now have a UN youth envoy. I think it's a great thing to have a youth envoy and youth representation. If they don't have decision-making power, if there's no way for the youth of the world to elect this person to be represented, what is this changing? Better to have them than not to have them, but what does it actually do? Nothing. Young people are still more unemployed. In Europe, have more difficulties in buying housing than before, in being able to find jobs. So it doesn't actually change anything. On how we make decisions, and so we are a political movement, right? So we have our own agenda. We don't pretend to represent everyone. We're very progressive. We don't represent conservative audiences. If they want a global political movement, they should build their own. We should have a global political space with parties that disagree. And we're very progressive. That won't be us. For anyone who is anti-LGBT rights or whatever, we tell them, yeah, go and build your own. That's not the place for you. However, we have certain guiding values to enable us to make policies that represent the interests of progressive people across the world. The three main pillars are equity, well-being, and freedom. So we strive for equity of individuals, groups, nations, and we don't think any country is more important. We think we need to readdress historical inequities and so on. And this means democratically, but also in terms of power, in terms of money, and so on. Well-being, our policies are aimed for well-being, which means of the planet, of communities, of countries, of individuals, and freedom, meaning we don't stand with authoritarian countries. We believe in individual rights, collective rights, etc. Those are guiding principles, and then we have a political philosophy called the philosophy of unity that we derive policies from. How we create them, we have teams of volunteers that work on those policies. We actually have a summit in 3 weeks. It's coming up really fast. And we'll vote on those policies, and then we'll disagree, and we'll pass amendments, and we'll vote again until we can come to some sort of agreement. And we strive to involve all the countries we have in making those policies, and to listen to people that are the most impacted or the most vulnerable when we talk about a policy first. And however, we're also a movement of volunteers, so nothing is bulletproof or perfect, and we get better as we go. And the overall thinking is we're a global movement, so at the global level, all of our volunteers vote and work together on policies that make sense for the world. And then we decline them, and local issues remain local, and people deal with them however they want. But the idea is let's try to have a way forward for the world.
Sounds good. I think it's going to be a lot of fruitful discussions you're going to have, especially at the moment. I'm sure there's a lot to talk about. And in your political program, which that caught my eye, you called it the survival build, because like I mentioned earlier, you are based on the idea that you need to save humanity's survival, and that our survival right now as human being is at risk. So what made you decide on this title, and what are some of the benefits and inconveniences of framing your goals in this way, in focusing on survival? And have you thought of anything else when you were looking for a title?
So we're not very creative when it comes to branding. So since we were dealing with survival issues, we're just like, oh, survival bill. Yeah, that works. I'm not going to pretend it was more complicated than this. But the thinking behind it was that I'm running for UN Secretary General, not because the system is working well or because I want that power, but because right now our survival is threatened by those issues and by the fact that the UN is not managing to deal with them. And climate is the easiest example. It's not the only one, but we are hitting a wall very, very fast. The UN climate chief said we have less than 2 years to change the tide, and our survival is at risk. So we're not some type of, extreme right-wing conspiracists that will tell you that you need to live in bunkers. But our survival is at risk. Poverty, growing inequalities puts humanity's survival, parts of humanity's survival at risk. People are dying every single day because of those challenges. So I would love to be able to focus on a more positive message. I'm actually a pretty optimistic person, despite the title of this program. I would love to be able to focus on, how we can all have access to incredible public services, and how we can work less and have more leisure, how we can, all of this. I would love my focus to be this. But the truth is, when you have so many massive challenges that are going untackled, and they are going untackled because they are difficult, because they are global, and because they require long-term political visions. You don't win on the short term with any of those. It requires sacrifices. It requires honesty and difficult decisions. When you have all of those threats, for me, it feels a bit ridiculous to focus on the smaller things at the global level. Not that we shouldn't improve public services. We definitely need to. But too often in political discussions, we move away from the very big threats the world is facing. Again, I talked about climate. We can talk about wars, right? The number of people, literally the aim of the United Nations is to ensure peace and security. And we have so many ongoing wars where you have international actors involved, providing weapons and so on. Gaza is the perfect example, and no ends in sight. So instead of speaking about, some ideal changes to make us all better, we need to focus on the very big survival threats. It's often a bit anxiety giving. It's often a bit less sexy than focusing only on well-being and so on. But I think it's what the UN is failing to do. And I think this is where you actually need political engagement.
Mm-hmm. Right. So a very bold and pragmatic approach, I see. And I share a lot of your passion that you are showing right now for protecting democracy, and also promoting it at the global level. And one dilemma that I have encountered in doing that is the tension between protecting democracy as a decision-making procedure and as a set of ideals and values. So this sort of like minimalist and maximalist democratic understanding. So from your perspective, how do you deal with that? And how should we deal with the possibility that democratic procedures may lead to ideas and policies which threaten democracy itself? And I think that we have seen now at the national level this situation in many cases.
Yeah, it's happening right now in France, right? Go and vote. I just voted online. So I think we think of democracy a lot as an end product, as a finished product. We think of democracy as this established thing that exists and that we're unhappy with often because it doesn't work well, because our problems are not necessarily fixed, right? Again, I'm French. As the French legislative elections, the president called elections with a 2.5 weeks timeline for parties to be able to run, like a week to submit candidates and so on. It's insane. It's undemocratic in itself, and it's insane. And people are unhappy with the system, are unhappy with the decisions, and are unhappy with the system. And so we think that democracy doesn't work. But I see democracy a bit differently. I don't think democracy is an established system. If you go around the world, democracy is practiced in many, many different ways. It can be very individualistic. It can be very community driven, right? It can be by living by consensus, by ensuring that no minority voice is forgotten. There's a lot of ways of practicing democracy that leads to drastically different results. So I don't think there's one system that works, and I don't think there's necessarily one democratic system that works everywhere. I think the problem we have is democracy in a lot, and I think we're both from Europe. So in Europe, for example, hasn't delivered for a lot of people. Our political system hasn't delivered for a lot of people. Our generation is the first one that is poorer than their parents. And people struggle every single day. And again, I'm very progressive and so on, but when I struggle to pay rent, that's my top priority. It's not even right. It's my top priority. And I'm not justifying certain political choices, because I think if you vote for a racist, xenophobic movement, you're putting your life over other people's, and that's never justifiable. But the harsh realities remain the same. And I think we blame democracy for this. We think that a strong man often would solve this. but without thinking that democracy can actually be improved, that if it's not delivering, we should change it. There's lots of examples of this happening. If you look at Taiwan, Taiwan actually went through something called the Sunflower Revolution, and where a group of hackers occupied parliaments. They were very unhappy with the democratic procedures. And now it's way more participative, digital, and they completely changed the way they practice democracy on hot topics. And they managed to arrive at insane level of consensus on some of the hottest conversations that society can see. I'm not saying it's bulletproof. I'm not saying it's perfect. Taiwan is a hyper-polarized society. But we can maybe learn something from this in order to do democracy better across the world. And that's where I see the strength of the global, in a way. You know, none of us are special little individuals. None of us live. We love to think of our countries as no, but this is very different. What I'm going through is very different. Every time I work with volunteers in different countries, and I often do the same, I'm like, no. You don't understand. This is super different from what happens elsewhere, because. And every time I have this conversation, it's not. It's the same thing. It's the same more or less problem. But the strength we have is we have hundreds of countries that have gone through this, hundreds of communities that have gone through this. So if we're able to look at one another and be like, oh, okay, this happened here, maybe I could actually learn and use some of the playbooks in order to be able to solve this issue. So, you know, in France, we're seeing the Front Populaire, and after Macron, President Macron said he would dissolve the National Assembly and call elections within 2 weeks, left-leaning parties built a popular front. Great idea. This was already done in India in this year's presidential elections. That meant that the current leader of the government had a harder time in forming a government. It was already historical. If we're able to look a bit at our strategies and so on, we would be able to try to prevent democratic backsliding. And we would also be able to improve enough so that people have faith in it. And then I'll shut up because I'm speaking too much. But basically, my point is, a lot of democracies actually have very big flaws, and people are very right to be angry about it, right? Democracies are often technocracies. It's often the same people we see in politics, because you need money, you need connections, you need free time, you need all of this. And the structures are not made to be heard, and the systems are not made to be heard. And as a result, people are left behind, etc. And it never really changes. And it's whatever, we can go on and on. But we can actually learn on how to change those structures to ensure that democracies are better, more resilient, and more innovative.
Totally, I share that assessment, and I think that there is a lot of hope, especially with, you know, how progress and technology has evolved recently. I think that there is, a source of hope to better listen to each other and to learn from each other. So I wanted to, now that we're reaching towards the end of this interview, I wanted to end on a positive note and ask you, imagine that we are in the year 2084. So a lot of time has passed. Most of your political goals have been met, and the dramatic consequences of climate change have been averted. What would the world look like? In other words, in your wildest dreams, how does global society exist?
So in a world where survival threats would no longer exist, I assume we would have new ones, but where survival threats no longer exist. So we actually have a global democratic governance. We actually, you know, Amazon is taxed where it operates, and we have better public services as a result. AI serves humanity, wonderful, and so on and so forth. I think we can actually picture a society that is much more equitable, meaning where all individuals have access to power, have access to wealth, meaning any individual can become a head of state. Any individual can live, if that's the aim, a life with financial security. I think we would live in a society that is where the wounds of the past have been healed. Meaning, I think we talk about global societies. They exist, but at the same time, I don't think we can be united, and I don't think we can work as one unless we heal the wounds of the past. What I mean is, a lot of countries, including mine, have committed horrible colonial crimes, but because they are powerful, because they are leading the global agenda, have never been held accountable. So how can you ask people to suddenly work together hand in hand when, you know, the financial system is still being held hostages by past crimes, by past financial structures, and so on? How can you do so? So we actually are able to move forward in a united way. And as a result, we're able to reap the benefits that come from a global society. Meaning we could all have access to a universal basic income. You know, if suddenly you have fair taxation and redistribution across the world, a universal basic income, where we get to not only live in a competitive manner, but suddenly be able to think about what fulfills us, about how we may contribute to the world, to our society, where we live more in adequation with our means, with nature, with our planet, where we live in peace. And I don't just mean the absence of war, but where, poverty does not exist. How can you say you live in a peaceful society if people are dying on the street? It's not peaceful. And I imagine this as a society of, high exchanges, collaboration, and yet deeply meaningful community relations that are possible. And with all of the new set of challenges that will exist with such a society, but where we don't have to worry every single day about whether a war is going to happen, whether people are dying because of a lack of means, when we have enough resources. And on this, I don't know if you ever saw this TikTok video. It's actually really funny, of a guy pretending to interview Planet Earth to join the Global Federation of Planets or something like this. I'll send it to you.
I have not seen that.
It's actually hilarious. So it's basically, it's a world where you have a lot of planets that are in the Federation. And Planet Earth is interviewing it. Really want to join the Galactic Federation, whatever it's called. And the guy is like, okay, so, have you explored other planets? No, not even Mars, but it's right next door. And okay, but at least you don't have poverty, right? And people like, he's like, why? Why do you have poverty? You don't have enough food, you don't have enough water. And Earth is like, well, no, it's because of administration. We don't redistribute. And he's like, people die because of administration, and on and on and on. And it's like, it shows the absurdity of a system where you live in a world of plenty, but you don't manage to do the basics so that people don't literally, we're talking about the basic, die because of malnutrition when we have enough food and money. So once we have achieved this, we can fight about all of the rest. My point is, let's get this under control before we fight about all of the rest.
Yeah, clearly, improving the efficiency of allocation of resources is definitely a big one that I think, like you said, is intersectional. Once that one is resolved, then the rest sort of like naturally follow. And I can imagine that being a political activist like yourself requires a lot of, like you said, positivity, hope, and courage. So what gives you hope? What are your favorite sources of inspiration, and what helps you to keep going? If you could recommend maybe a book, a movie, or a podcast, what would it be?
So I know people say a lot, you need hope to move forward. I mainly operate out of anger a lot of the time. It's because I'm very angry at the system that I do that. If I was, happy, and I mean, I am happy, but if, I thought everything was great and had so much hope, why would I get active? I think the system is insane. I think it's completely abnormal, and it angers the hell out of me that we accept that over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed and still provide weapons. I find this insane, and that is what gives me energy, because I think it's, unless we do something, more people literally will die. And that is the same with a lot of those challenges. The fact that, again, I'm going back on Amazon, doesn't pay its taxes where it operates when people die of poverty drives me insane. It drives me nuts when we have the capacity to do something about it. Because the thing is, for a lot of those challenges, the structures miss. So it seems very difficult, but we actually have all of the solutions, or most of them, even for climate, all of the tech and all of the money to be able to solve all of those challenges. We just miss the political will. So in a way, the fact that we have all of the solutions gives me hope, but I'm angry as hell that politicians are so short-sighted that they're not solving those issues. On a bit of more less angry note, the one thing I would say that gives me hope is seeing people all over the world being willing to do the hard work. So Atlas is a volunteer-fueled and powered movement, and seeing people from literally all over the world speaking different languages, going through their own hardships, and so on, being willing to take the time and the energy and to work for change, I find it incredibly beautiful. And for example, right now in Kenya, you have protests that have turned deadly. The government has used an insane amount of force and killed, abducted, arrested people. Our volunteers are on the streets and yet find time to join cause, to try to work for global change, etc. And this, I mean, it's not even hope. I mean, I find them absolutely incredible.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a wonderful opportunity to chat with you and to learn more about what you're doing and your vision for global governance and politics on the global level. I have one last question. So if people are interested in joining Atlas and in joining that movement that you are driving forward, what can they do? Where can they find you?
So it's atlasmovement.org, and you're able to volunteer, donate, and become a member. Those are the three main things. What it means is volunteers from all over the world bring this work forward, run for elections, administer the teams. Donations like $3 to $10 a month are literally what finance us very badly, but still finance us at last. And by being a member, you have voting rights on our policies, strategies, etc. So those are the three main ways of getting involved. We also host extremely regular events, including our summit in July, that you'll be able to attend. And finally, vote for me, endorse me for United Nations Secretary General. It's at unite for like the number survival.org.
Super. Thank you so much, Colombe, for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Same. Thank you so much, Sophie, for having me.